On the day February 24, 2001, the air was cold and damp in the Tennessee mountains when two experienced explorers arrived at the entrance to one of the region's most challenging caves. The Rattling Cave. Unlike tourist caves or well-known trails, this cave was not a place for beginners. The main entrance was a vertical well, more than 40 meters of depth, a direct plunge into darkness. For many, just looking into that abyss would be reason enough to give up. But for Ray Pritchett, 34 years old, and his exploration partner, Michael Green, that represented exactly the kind of challenge that kept their hearts alive. Both had years of experience in caving. They knew how to assemble ropes, operate rappelling equipment, and handle hostile environments where any mistake could be fatal. And on that day, they weren't looking for reckless adventure. They were there to explore a part of the cave that few had seen, a deep, narrow, and silent route where time seemed to stand still. Before descending, they began the most important procedure. Preparing the equipment, ropes were attached to anchor points, knots were checked. Each piece of metal clanged with a dry, metallic sound. Green was the first to descend. With controlled movements, he let his body slide slowly down the rope, disappearing into the darkness below. When his feet touched the bottom of the pit, he looked up and saw only a small circle of light above, the outside world receding into the distance. Ray then positioned himself on the edge of the precipice. He adjusted therminder rack, connected the equipment to self-locking carabiner. He took a deep breath and took his first step towards total darkness. The descent was beginning. They didn't imagine that, on that very descent, a tiny detail in your equipment would change everything. The light filtering through the cave opening faded as Ray slowly descended, following the same rope Michael had used minutes before. The sensation was almost surreal. The air seemed denser inside, cold, laden with the typical dampness of places where the sun never reaches. The walls of the shaft were dark, uneven rock, reflecting only small fragments of light from his flashlight. Despite being a vertically expansive space, there was a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the echoing sound of metal sliding on the rope and Ray's controlled breathing. Down below, Michael waited, his flashlight pointed upwards, following Ray's silhouette as he descended. They communicated little. In deep caves, sound is lost, dispersed, distorted. Words are unreliable. What matters is the language of experience, calculated movements, trust in equipment, absolute attention. Ray kept his body relaxed, yet firm. His hands controlled the rack with precision. This type of descent doesn't allow for rushing. Every inch needs to be considered. Every foothold on the wall has to be calculated. A poorly executed descent can twist the body, displace the rope, create friction, cause accidents. And he knew it. The self-locking carabiner, attached to his harness, was supposed to be a safety feature, the kind of equipment you put on and forget about. But in the cave, any small detail can turn into danger. Dust, mud, a wrong angle, uneven weight distribution. None of that seems important when everything is calm. But on that descent, even Ray didn't realize that the equipment wasn't exactly in the right position. As he passed over a small ledge in the wall, resting the rack against the rock to reposition himself, there was a slight crack, not a loud sound, not something that immediately caught his attention, just an almost insignificant, muffled noise. But something there had changed, and neither of them had yet realized it. Ray continued descending, believing he was completely safe. The surrounding darkness seemed to silently observe. As Ray continued his descent, the surrounding environment seemed increasingly narrow and deep. The light from the surface was nothing more than a distant memory, a point that had completely disappeared. Only the concentrated beam of his flashlight illuminated the endless fall of the walls, revealing small details. Erosion marks, loose rock slabs, drops of water trickling down as if the cave were still breathing, alive, patient. Michael watched from below, following every movement. He had seen descents like that countless times, but something about this situation seemed to demand even greater caution. The Rattling Cave was known precisely for that. It wasn't a place that forgave distractions. Ray remained calm. His body weight was evenly distributed, his hand gently controlling the rack. He was slowly approaching the final stretch of the descent when he needed to make a movement to reposition his foot against a side wall. At that instant, the rack scraped against the rock again. A second crack, almost identical to the first. echoed dryly through the shaft. This time, Michael immediately raised his face. "Is everything all right in there?" he shouted, his voice echoing in a distorted way through the cave. Ray paused briefly. He inspected the equipment. Everything seemed normal. Nothing out of place. There was no visible play, no strange movement. "Everything's fine," he replied, though his voice had a slight hesitation that even he didn't notice. But, in fact, in that second snap, the plastic locking mechanism on the carabiner was starting to give way. Not broken yet, not open, just stretched beyond the limit. It was the kind of damage that doesn't scream, he just waits. Ray resumed his descent, unaware that his entire body weight was now strapped to a piece of equipment that was holding more weight than it should, at an angle that should never have been there. Any slight change, a more abrupt tug, a harder scrape on the wall, or even a simple position adjustment. Anything could happen in a single, silent, and irreversible instant. The descent progressed, and the bottom of the shaft no longer seemed so far away. Michael could see Ray more clearly now, the beam of light from his flashlight outlining the body suspended in the void. At first, it seemed like just another rappel, like so many others they had done together. But anyone who practices caving knows, a deep vertical environment is never truly ordinary. Every second demands attention. Every touch on the rope, every breath, every adjustment of the weight matters. Ray moved his foot again, searching for a foothold on the damp wall to stabilize his body before continuing his descent. The sidewall, covered in a thin layer of mud, slipped beneath his sole. It was an involuntary movement. Quick, almost instinctive. He compensated, pulling on the rack to control his descent and maintain his balance. And it was precisely this movement that placed a sudden load on the carabiner. It wasn't an exaggerated tug. It wasn't a gross mistake. It was just a reflex. But it was enough. The plastic latch, already weakened by the 2 previous snaps, received a lateral pressure at that moment that it simply wasn't designed to withstand. The material didn't break all at once. It cracked a dry, muffled sound that was lost in the dark emptiness of the well. Ray heard the noise. It stopped again. He glanced quickly at the equipment one more time. Everything still seemed to be in place, but the problem was now invisible to the eye. The crack was there, discreet, silent, hidden on the side of the carabiner, an almost imperceptible line that separated stability from catastrophe. Michael, down below, was watching attentively. "Keep going slowly," he said, his voice serious. Feeling something he couldn't explain, Ray took a deep breath. He held the rope. He adjusted the rack, and the descent resumed. Without knowing that, now everything depended on a single second. Ray continued to descend, inch by inch, without haste. He knew, and Michael knew too, that in that kind of environment, haste is the enemy of life. The darkness around them was so profound that it seemed to absorb sound, making each movement even more isolated and heavy. Ray's breath echoed faintly inside the helmet. The rope creaked. The metal slid. Nothing else existed in that moment. Down below, Michael watched intently, now not just as an exploration partner, but as someone who sensed, albeit intuitively, that something wasn't quite right. It's difficult to explain this kind of feeling. It's not fear. It's not panic. It's an attention forced by the environment, almost as if the cave itself were giving a warning. Ray was just a few feet off the ground when he made one more body adjustment, tilting his hips to reposition his weight and keep the rack aligned. It was a practiced movement, repeated hundreds of times over the years. An automatic movement, technical, precise. But this time, there was a factor that transformed the familiar into something dangerous. The load wasn't distributed where it should have been. The crack in the carabiner, which had started silently, now acted like a fracture line about to give way. Any sudden change could turn that microscopic crack into a complete rupture. Michael noticed that Ray stopped again. "Are you feeling anything at the anchor?" he shouted, trying to keep his voice steady, even though he wasn't sure why he was asking the question. Ray hesitated. He didn't want to admit, even to himself, that something was amiss. "One maybe just mud on the equipment," he replied, trying to sound calm. But what was about to happen wouldn't be caused by mud. Not due to lack of experience, not even through gross error. It was one of those situations where danger arises from the detail, from what no one sees, from the exact point where trust meets the limit of chance. The rope swayed slightly. Ray made the next move, The pressure has shifted, and it was at that moment that the world around him seemed to slow down. Ray felt something very subtle, a slight shift at the point where the rack connected to his harness. It wasn't a jolt, it wasn't a pull, it was a sensation, as if his body, previously firmly supported, had lost a fraction of its stability. Something almost imperceptible to anyone who hadn't spent years hanging from ropes. He stopped immediately. I said nothing. He just stayed there, suspended, a few meters off the ground, trying to figure out what his body had felt before his mind understood. Michael noticed the abrupt silence. Ray, the voice echoed, strange, slow, as if the cave were swallowing the sound. Ray looked at the carabiner. The flashlight illuminated the metal, the layer of mud, the faint reflection of light, the familiar outline of the equipment. Everything looked the same, but something wasn't right. He carefully brought his hand closer. Without shifting his weight on the rope, he touched the carabiner with his finger. The metal was firm, but there was a detail that shouldn't be there. A slight vibration, almost like a minimal tremor, coming from the point where the locking mechanism met the eye of the rack. It was the kind of vibration that doesn't occur in a well-maintained piece of equipment. It was the kind of vibration that comes when tension is being held at its limit. Michael tried to observe from below, but the distance and lighting made it impossible to detect the real problem. "Would you like to go up a bit? Check again?" he asked, trying to remain calm. Ray knew that going up would require repositioning his body. Repositioning the body would require movement, and movement was exactly what he didn't want at that moment. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his mind clear. Caves teach us this. Fear cannot dominate the movement, but ignoring fear is also a death sentence. For a few seconds, long, silent, heavy, Ray remained completely still. The entire world was reduced to him. The rope, the rock, and the carabiner that was now the only point between his life and the void. The silence in the cave became absolute, almost conscious. Ray then decided to do what any experienced speleologist would do when they realize something is potentially wrong. Test the weight very slowly. Very, very slowly. His hand began to move. The rope creaked. The equipment responded, and fate, silently, awaited the next millimeter. Ray began to carefully test the weight, almost as if he were learning to move for the first time. Every millimeter was considered. He took a deep breath, trying to distribute the load between his body, the rope, and the rack. But at that moment, his fate was already decided. The carabiner, which appeared to be only cracked, finally gave way. There wasn't a big snap. There was no shouting, just a dry, short sound, tick, followed by the sudden disappearance of tension. For a split second, Ray felt his body float in the air, as if suspended in free fall, weightless, as if time had been ripped from reality. The flashlight spun, casting distorted shadows on the cave walls as he descended rapidly. Michael only had time to raise his hands and shout his friend's name. "Ray!" Ray fell, but it wasn't a complete fall. The main rope, still attached to the anchor, grazed the wall, reducing his speed somewhat. He hit the ground hard, forcefully enough to knock the air out of his lungs and cause him to tumble sideways. The flashlight fell, ricocheting off the rock, illuminating the scene in confused movements. The impact was brutal, but not fatal. Ray was alive, dazed, motionless for a few seconds, trying to understand if he could still feel his own body. Michael ran to him immediately, his knees knocking on the damp stones. "Talk to me. Listen to me." His voice trembled, his breathing rapid. Ray tried to speak, but could only manage a weak breath, as if he were relearning how to breathe. He was conscious, but he knew that, by a few centimeters of fate, the story could have ended there. It was at that moment that they both understood, without needing to say anything. In caves, a detail is never just a detail. He can be anything.